or at least that's what their parents thought. The only explanation Esme offered, as she finally stood before us breathless, was that there was an emergency at the office that required her immediate attention, and she'd be home before midnight. It didn't escape my notice that she was wearing her long trench coat and her diamond earrings, while her hair was perfectly styled. I was wondering if Dr. Cullen had a work emergency as well, as we all assured him we could fend for ourselves for the evening. Alessandro's left at 6, leaving me alone in the quiet house as I happily began preparing Edward's large Valentine's Day meal. It was rather time-consuming, taking me 3 hours to make everything from scratch, even though I had already prepared some of it earlier in the day. I furrowed my brows at the various mixing bowls and pans used to prepare the chicken pot pie, homemade macaroni and cheese, which he seemed to favor greatly at Thanksgiving, and a dessert of banana pudding. I usually didn't bother with dessert when I brought Edward food at night, but it was my only Valentine's Day gift, so I eagerly went slightly extravagant with the whole affair. I still made my Valentine pineapple pears at 9, working a strategic placement of the cookie sheets inside of the already occupied oven rather successfully. And by 10, I had so many containers filled with food that my back sack was straining against the zipper as I swatted my curls away from my face and forced it closed with a triumphant grin. So, I kept the red gauzy, needle-ink tiered skirt on, and I realized I was only doing it because Edward thought it was sexy, and it felt scratchy against my legs, but it was more than worth it. It was also quite possible that my chunky boots and black hoodie didn't go with it at all, but I didn't care as I slung my bag onto my back and locked my bedroom door securely. I took one more trip around the house, making sure it appeared as though I had gone to bed, before finally stepping out the back door. My curls once again whipped around my head as I stalked across the dark yard carefully and eventually began climbing the familiar white lattice up to Edward's balcony. The full bag bounced on my back as I finally made it over the railing, finding my footing on the balcony silently with a victorious smirk as I raised my fist to the door and tapped quietly. Edward was waiting for me like always as he opened the door, standing in the bright room and gazing into my eyes with a crooked smile as I entered. No crease. I was once again thankful for my better mood as I turned to face him when the door closed, because the moment he turned the full force of his intense green eyes on me, I felt at home, alone in the room with Edward, with no creases or bitterness, as he pulled me to him and kissed me softly on the lips. Just as I was about to tangle my fingers in his hair and deepen it, he brought his hands up to my shoulder and slipped the straps of my bag off while pulling away from my lips. He quirked an eyebrow at me.
"Are we hoarding away for the winter, or some shit?"
he asked, as he pulled a heavy, bulging sack from back.
"Not that I would object or anything."
He winked. I rolled my eyes as I pried the bag from his grip and made my way to the bed. "It's a special occasion." I shrugged nonchalantly as I unzipped the bag and produced the thin blanket I had brought. He glanced at me curiously as I spread it out on top of the bed with pursed lips and began unloading all of the many containers. His eyes grew wide as the pile of containers grew.
"You do realize that one person can only eat so much food?"
he murmured while he furrowed his brows at the bed. I rolled my eyes again as I removed the 2 cans of sodas from the bag and kicked my boots off. "Yes, but I made food for 2 people," I replied with a smile as I handed him a soda. Understanding finally crossed his features as he nodded at me with a smile. I had never actually eaten with Edward in his room before, having usually eaten with Alice and Esme earlier in the evening. But tonight was different. Edward's eyes slowly wandered down my body to my bare legs for a split second, before he quickly diverted his gaze to the containers on the bed, and flopped down at the edge of the blanket. I turned around to remove my hoodie, feeling anxious about the top I was wearing as I pulled the hoodie off and glanced down at my chest dubiously. It was like the cleavage had become impossibly more obscene over the last 4 hours. I adjusted the fabric to cover the red bra as I heard the sound of a can being opened behind me. I took a steadying breath as I began regretting my decision not to change clothes. I could feel the heat creeping up my face as I slowly turned to face Edward on the bed. He had a can of soda up to his mouth as I turned to face him and tossed my hoodie on the end of the bed. His green eyes grew wide as they finally settled on my chest. His hand slowly lowered the can from his mouth as I climbed onto the bed, blushing furiously as his eyes followed my cleavage, and he gulped thickly. He quickly shifted his eyes to the blanket, running his free hand through his hair as he blindly set the can on the bedside table. I settled in front of him with my legs wrapped around me in an attempt to be ladylike with the whole skirt situation as I reached for the containers and uncovered them, distributing them evenly in front of each of us. He kept his eyes on the dishes as he smiled down at them, picking up the fork and licking it enthusiastically. I smiled as he hummed in appreciation and began eating myself while listening to his content sounds. The chicken pot pie was definitely a winner, tasting quite delicious with the macaroni and cheese, as we ate in silence for a while. Edward reached over to the night table and picked up his soda, finally darting his eyes up to meet my gaze, while I smiled at him.
So,
he started quietly as his gaze wandered down my neck and suddenly to his food, while he furrowed his brows lightly.
did you go anywhere today?
He asked while bringing the can to his lips. I pursed my lips and tilted my head slightly. Just here, I replied honestly, sliding the fork into my mouth as he lowered the can from his lips and set it back down. An oddly relieved expression crossed his face as he nodded and resumed eating.
Edward's point of view. Thank fucking God. Because her tits were nearly spilling out of that dark red top. I didn't personally have any complaints with looking at them myself, but I was afraid I would have to commit a small murder spree, where any other motherfucker's eyes were concerned. I knew my girl better than that though. She was still blushing like crazy as she ate her meal silently in front of me. I allowed the hormonal teenage motherfucker inside of me to eye her bare legs as they wrapped around her and ducked under the frilly red skirt that spilled onto the blanket beneath us. I couldn't even allow my eyes to wander to her chest because I wouldn't be able to look away quickly enough to assure her comfort. Fucking Brandon and Rose dressing my girl up like a goddamn doll and somehow hurting her feelings in the process. I was pissed off when M came banging at my door with the vague explanation that I had a visitor. I'm not sure who I was expecting, but when I saw Bella standing in the foyer with red puffy eyes, I was slightly panicked. Then those two showed up, pretty much answering my every question as my girl cried on my chest. Not to even mention the way they were both just fucking gaping at me while I stood there trying to comfort her. So I was more than relieved when she showed up at my door, without any forced smiles or bitter attitudes. And truthfully, she really did look fucking sexy in that skirt. And then there were always the shiny fucking curls flowing down her back, and bouncing, as she climbed onto the bed. Bouncing around her chest as she leaned over just enough to give me a full view of fucking Christ. I had to stop thinking about it. I ate the delicious pot pie and macaroni and cheese as I moaned and hummed, making my girl smile with every bite and forcing my attention on anything but the breasts. I had been holding them in my hands for almost a week with no signs of the safe word. There was no excuse for me to be staring at them like I couldn't be touching them every night. I was rather surprised to find that she had also brought dessert.